So our book tonight is A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronski. It was published in 2011 and was a winner of the Stonewall Award in 2012. Since its publication, it has been banned or challenged numerous times. One example is the Alta Aurelia Community School District in Iowa, where the book was removed pending investigation due to a new law, SF 496, that restricts LGBTQ topics from being discussed in schools. And just this year, the Department of Defense Education Activity, which provides pre-kindergarten, elementary, and secondary education to approximately 67,000 dependents of military personnel around the world, has removed A Queer History and placed it in quarantine in compliance with Trump's executive orders banning topics such as gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology from federally funded K-12 education. So we're really, really excited to have Michael here tonight joining us. He's been involved in gay liberation as a political organizer, a writer, and editor for more than 4 decades. The author of several award-winning books, including A Queer History of the United States, he co-authored You Can Tell Just by Looking, and 20 other myths about LGBT life and people. And most recently, Considering Hate with Kay Whitlock. Michael is a professor of the practice in activism and media in the studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we'll put spotlight on Michael.
Yep, we got Michael spotlighted. Julie, I'm going to take you off spotlight for a moment.
Okay.
Okay, and Michael, I'm going to start your slides.
Great. So I thought that I'm a little bit. I'm watching all the people. I'm watching people's faces here. So I think I thought it'd be interesting, since I'm working on a revision of this book, which will be out in 2026, that I would highlight two people and an incident that I'm writing about now that'll be in the new version, that's not in the version that you read. And this will only be 8 or 9 minutes doing this, just to give you a hint of what's not in the original. And these are the two people I had never heard of until fairly recently. And the event is something I knew about, but I hadn't included it for the first one. So I want to begin talking about, and then we can do questions after this, Margaret Chung, who's getting more profile than she had for decades. Margaret Chung was born in 1889 in Santa Barbara. She was the oldest of 11 children. She's Chinese American, was born here. She helped support her family from the age of 10. She was a star pupil at a mission school, and then she went to USC, and she graduated USC in 1909. And in 1911, she became the first woman of Chinese descent to enroll in a medical school. She's also the first Chinese woman to be a U.S. doctor. When she was, next slide, Ada. When she was in medical school, she took on a new persona, dressed as a man, called herself Mike. She said she did this because she was the only woman there and she wanted to fit in, but obviously she's very comfortable doing it. This is her graduation photo. Next slide. You can spot her. She's the bottom row, the third one from the left. Fitting in very nicely with all the other boys. You'll notice that she's actually the only person of color that's in the picture as well. She graduated, held a number of jobs as a doctor and actually as a registered nurse at one point. She became the resident assistant in psychiatric care for the first juvenile psychopathic institute in the state of Illinois in 1917. She was a job a woman had never had before. She was later appointed state criminologist for Illinois. In 1918, she returned to Los Angeles, became a surgeon at the Santa Fe Railroad Hospital. She quickly became a surgeon to celebrities. She became very famous for moving Mary Pickford's tonsils, and moved to San Francisco in 1922 and opened up her own office for people within the Chinese community. She was actually the first person to treat people within the community with Western medicine as well as traditional Chinese medicine. So she was actually branching the two. At the hospital, right, where she was a surgeon, she also treated Hollywood stars like Sophie Tucker, Mary Astor, Tallulah Bankhead, and she became pretty much a local celebrity for doing this. Attended first night openings, next slide, Ada, and social gatherings. So you can see her here. She's sort of in her mannish dress and then in her glamorous dress at an opening here. During the mid later 30s, she also treated many armed forces members and veterans, so much that she gathered a group of them around her for social occasions, often having 50 or 80 people over for a dinner. They called her Mom Chung, and they called themselves Mom Chung's fair-haired bastard sons. When Japan invaded China in 1937, she helped the Air Force, actually the first American volunteer group, to form the famous Flying Tigers group, which is a small group of people who actually were supporting China fighting off the Japanese invasion. Next slide, Ada. Yes, here she is. And here she is in a war office and posing with some boxes going off to Women's Relief. During this time, she was also very involved, and she never gets credit for this, helping the government form the Waves, which was the women's auxiliary for the Navy. And this was all done underground because she couldn't work for the government and be a physician during the same time. Next slide, Ada. Here she is socializing with some of the servicemen and with a comic book that came out about her. It's about 1942, I believe. By the end of the war, she had at least 1,500 bastard sons, as she called them, and was friendly with almost everyone in Hollywood and large parts of the federal government with whom she worked. She was very quiet about her personal life. She had to be, because to be openly lesbian would have been unthinkable. She would have lost her job. But she was lovers with the very, very famous stage star and singer Sophie Tucker, and the very well-known poet Elsa Gidlow, Canadian poet. She died in 1959 at the age of 64, I believe. So I want to go on to the next slide, Ada, to somebody who I had never heard of, and a colleague of mine was doing research on her, from California, Lucy Hicks Anderson. Lucy Hicks Anderson was born in 1886 in a small town in Kentucky. She was assigned male at birth, but as a child, she insisted that she was female. Amazingly, her parents, on doctor's advice, in like 1890 something, let her dress and act like a girl, and she went to school and everybody was fine with that. This is before 1900. At the age of 15, living as a woman, she began doing domestic work to support herself. Next slide. And so I don't have a lot of photographs of her because she only became famous later. Here she is playing with some kids that she was taking care of here. At the age of 20, she moves to Texas and worked in a hotel and married a man named Clarence Hicks, and began to win baking contests and gained a great deal of fame as a chef and as a baker, and was making money. Hicks passed away. 9 years later, she moved to Oxnard, California, where, I'm sorry, Mr. Hicks passes after this, where they saved enough money to buy some land in a boarding house. She became very much a celebrity chef among wealthy people and a socialite. She was something of a philanthropist as well for the African American community. Next slide, Ada. Here she is looking fairly glamorous, sitting in a nice home here, a socialite here. I forgot to mention this before, but the boarding house was actually a brothel. So during this time, she married Reuben Anderson, who was a soldier. And a little bit after this, a sailor reported that he had gotten gonorrhea at her boarding house. And the health department demanded that everyone there be tested for VD, or what was called VD then, we now call it STIs. It was then discovered that she was assigned male at birth, and it was reported, because she was quite famous in the town, it was reported in the newspapers. All of her friends stood by her. The story is that she was taken to jail because the charge was that she lied on her birth certificate, and the mayor of the town got her out of jail that night because he needed her to make a fancy dinner for him because he had people visiting. Next slide, Ada. Here she is being arrested, looking, I must say, quite composed. She was also charged with collecting her first husband's army pay, because they weren't really married, so that was illegal, and went to trial. The story, next slide, Ada. And here she is with her lawyer. You'll notice at the bottom here, her is in quotes and Lucy is in quotes. So even though her grade school teachers were fine with her being a girl at that point, the newspaper actually refused to admit this. The story was picked up by the local paper and was a feature 2 weeks later in Time magazine. So she became a national story. So this is, if you know this other name, this is years before Christine Jorgensen became famous, allegedly as the first trans woman in America, the first famous one. She and Rubin received jail sentences for less than 2 years, but she was made to go to a men's prison and wear men's clothing. Next slide, Ada. And this is, she was let out. She and her husband actually moved to Los Angeles and lived quietly for the rest of her life. She died in 1954. But it's quite incredible that here's this woman who had national attention, and is literally almost, we know quite a bit about her from newspaper things, but really she's not known at all. So I'd just like to end with an incident. I'm sure everybody knows, if you read the book or you haven't read the book, about Stonewall, which is the riot that happened in Greenwich Village, where the modern gay movement was born. And I'd like to argue that Stonewall was only part of the beginning for the LGBT movement. I want to argue that it was a raid on a bar called the Snake Pit 9 months later in March. Stonewall is June of 69. That was really the beginning of a series of political actions that I would argue is much more the beginning for the LGBTQ movement. Here's next slide, Ada. This is so if you see on the bottom here, you see going downstairs, the little fence going down to the basement on the second door in on the left-hand side. The Snake Pit was in the basement. And it was an after hours bar, which meant that after the other bars closed, they would stay open till 5 or 6 in the morning, illegally, but they happened all over the city. The police raided the bar at 4 in the morning and arrested 167 men. So the police had learned their lesson, right? Because at Stonewall, they only arrested a few people and there was a riot. By arresting all 167, everybody that was in the bar, they thought they could stop that. The police took everybody to the police station, which is about 2.5 blocks away, and there was an Argentinian man named Diego Vinales whose visa had expired, and he panicked and jumped from a second-story window. So I want to trigger warning. The next photo is really hard to look at. We'll leave it up for people to see what it is and then take that. After he jumped, he was impaled on a spiked fence, an iron fence outside of the police station. Next slide. And was impaled on several spikes. He actually lived, so that's the good news. But the fire department had to literally cut the fence to take him to the hospital for surgery. But the amazing thing is at the police station. So keep in mind, this is 8 or 9 months after Stonewall. People are just learning how to organize. at the police station, some other men who were there broke into an office and began to make phone calls to everybody that they knew from the Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance, because it's now 8 a.m. And literally within an hour, people began to hand out this handwritten flyer. And you could read this. I'll give you a little bit of time to read it here. It gives all the details. It gives the phone number to call. It tells you everything. It tells you that there's somebody who's near death at St. Vincent's Hospital, which was about 4 blocks away from where the snake pit was. Right, and you could see as it goes down, fighting gays and many of you who call yourself human beings with guts, stand up to this horror, gather at Sheridan Square tonight, March 8th, the afternoon and the evening of the raid, right, which was 4 a.m. Stop the raid, defend your rights. There'll be a death watch vigil. Luckily, it was not a death watch vigil, right? And next slide, Ada. Right, and I think this is just an excerpt, and I think really potently, right, they argue any way you look at it, that boy was pushed. Right. So immediately people took action in the streets, and it really is, what you're really seeing here is a community learning how to take action and learning how to actually do a demonstration without social media, without Facebook, without Twitter or X. Right. And people began to pass this out, crowds formed in front of the police station and in front of the hospital. Next slide. Ada? Yes. So, and it was a big enough deal that the New York Times the next day ran a rather long article, which they never did about Stonewall particularly, giving all the details, specifically naming members of the Gay Liberation Front, telling people where the hospital is, essentially giving I'm sure they didn't intend to, but telling people where there was a march and how they might go to it. Next slide. Right, and crowds continue to actually protest and march. Here we have a rather startling picture of just by the police station, which was on Bleecker, I believe, around the corner from the snake pit. Right, and then the next slide, which is a picture outside of St. Vincent's Hospital. One boy near death at St. Vincent's. A lone protester. I'm sure there are other people around him, right? So what I would argue, right, is that while Stonewall was an explosion of justified anger and the organizing around what we see with the snake pit raid is that it really showed you what people were doing on the ground in the moment, literally within 2 hours, to actually fight the police and actually get people out and protesting. So I just wanted to do those 3 things to give you a hint of what's coming up for what's included for the next book. But I'd love to hear questions about, I think Julie has some questions about the book, and I hope all of you do as well.
Okay, I'm spotlighting Julie. You guys take it away.
All right. So the first question that I have for you, Michael, is why is this book needed now?
Well, I think we've always needed it, right? In the book, it's interesting because one of the first things I say in the book, right, is that that there's no such thing as queer history, right? What this is just American history. Mm-hmm. And that the point of it is to actually highlight everything that's been left out. And this is, of course, true of African American history, Latinx history, women's history, mm-hmm. Any other minoritized group's history, right? So I think we've always needed it. I think at this so the book is 15 years old now, or will be next year, right? Which means I wrote it 18 years ago. I've been involved doing this sort of work since 69, a long time, since right after Stonewall. And it's quite amazing. Nobody had written, and I have to say up front, the book was not my idea, it was my editor's idea. But people had done casual histories of some things, and people had actually done some collections of primary source documents, but nobody had done a cohesive history. And I think it's just, it's always been time to revise American history, whatever that means. And clearly it's much more complicated than what we're taught. In fact, I did this presentation a while ago called "Everything You Learned in High School and Probably College Was Wrong."
That's pretty accurate too.
And actually continues to be, and they're still suppressing the book.
Hmm. So, how has the concept of privacy changed over time? How does that concept actually affect people and the types of political organizing happening today?
Sure, that's a great question, right? Because so in so many ways, politically in the country, and certainly this is true of the LGBTQ movement, right? Particularly the gay rights movement. So I try to say that in the book, I make this distinction. I think it's useful that Stonewall was was the beginning of the gay liberation movement.
Hmm.
Stonewall happened because people were fed up with the police raiding the bar, and people, but the gay liberation front was very much in the realm of the Black Panthers, radical feminists, anti-war movement. I mean, the early gay liberation meetings were as much about racism and ending the war and reproductive rights as they were about gay rights, right? But because the state, right, the big state, right, was always intrusive into people's lives, right, preventing them or arresting them when they had sex, arresting them for how they looked on the street, right? People really felt that they wanted, and they should have it, the right to privacy, right? Um, not to be bothered in, as the phrase goes, in the privacy of their own home, as a standard piece of early British common laws. A man's home, the Cook Law, right? The man's home is a man's home is his castle, right? And that's great. People should have privacy, but we have to realize that privacy should not come at the expense of being able to be public, right? It's like yes, you shouldn't be arrested in your bedroom for having sex like Michael Hardwick was, and Michael Hardwick was the man at the center of Bowers v. Hardwick, who was literally arrested in his bedroom for having sex with a man, and the Supreme Court said that there was no right to homosexual sodomy, although there was to heterosexual sodomy, right? So that I think it's important to when we think about privacy to realize that it can never be at the expense of the right to be public, right? Because the term republic, right, comes from the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing, and we all have the right to be public.
Well, for right now, we do.
I have to say that I teach a class at Harvard called Power to the People, Black Power, Radical Feminism, and Gay Liberation, about 60s movement. And I sort of decided this year that I was not going to make references to anything happening currently politically because it would be obvious. And I didn't for the most part, but every class, it was so glaringly obvious.
Yeah. I bet. Well, and it seems that historically, when I was reading the book, be a man is the divider of queer or not queer. And that was really interesting to me, that manhood has come to be a sexual orientation marker. So how do changing ideas of masculinity shape American history, including queer American history?
Yeah, no, that's really it's really interesting, right? Because we can go. I'll quickly go back to 1776, and then quickly move to the present. Right, America's formed. We're colonies. We fight the British. We claim our independence, and America really needs to invent itself because we're actually British until we say we're not, right? And part of that reinvention, right, was really reinventing a sort of a new American man, right? So we have these myths coming up of Daniel Boone, Jim Bowie, Paul Bunyan, who's actually mythical,
Frontier
right?
kind of guys.
The other two are real, right? And the sort of rugged frontiersman out in the we never heard in grade school that they were actually murdering indigenous people and taking their land, but but they were and enslaving other people, right? but this was the new American man versus the effete British fop. Even though I'd point out that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wore sort of as fruity looking wigs and looked pretty foppish.
Yeah.
uh, so in America, right, the sort of marker of being a man got, no matter what people's lives were, became very much an ideal and became very much associated with heterosexuality.
Mm.
Right. So as this evolved, and it's a complicated story because it happens less in Europe than here, that in fact, and what you said was correct, right? That in fact, masculinity became a marker of heterosexuality,
Mhm.
even though certainly there were plenty of very, very butch men who were completely gay. Right. But I think, I think the relevance today, right, is that the I don't know what word I want, the insanity of the manosphere and the insanity of hypermasculinity and the insanity of hypermilitarism um is well, going to kill everybody on the planet, but
Mhm.
but is the direct descendant of Daniel Boone and Jim Bowie.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, in the book, you talk about the formation of same-sex communities, um, and where people actually lived together. But now people are forming communities on the internet.
Mhm.
So, does this allow for more connections or less connection? What do you think?
Well, again, a great question because like my students always, you're talking about gay liberation or you're talking about ACT UP or any other movement before social media, and they said, well, how do they do it if they didn't have social media?
Mhm.
And and the answer is you did it with flyers and and taped the telephone poles and telephone calls and a phone tree, right? You just couldn't go on Facebook and announce a demonstration, right? So social media, right, really gives an incredible oomph to how you can connect with people and how you can do organizing,
Mhm.
right? It also, I think, has severe limitations that people have to admit. So there was a group about 15 years ago, right, that called, they just for name like Just in Time or something around same-sex marriage. And they got enormous numbers on Facebook. And it turns out that hardly anybody came out for the demonstrations. They were all likes.
Mhm.
I like this. Yes, I'll be there,
Mhm.
So, I mean, as great as social media is in many ways, it really cannot take the place of actually getting people in a room, in a building, on a street corner, in a field to come out to
Mhm.
some. I mean, it's really useful to do that, but it doesn't get them there.
Mhm.
You have to find other ways to do that in conjunction with social media.
So many cities are celebrating Pride this month, this
Mhm.
June. What's the origin of Pride?
Well, the first Pride marches were. I mean, it's an interesting question because I've had students say to me, it must have been really, really terrible being gay before Stonewall because there was so much shame and you didn't have any pride. And I thought, well, not really. People didn't have shame and they had pride. So the marker really is, the Stonewall uprising. But we used to say riots. Now we say it's an uprising, right? The way that we say that the uprising in Watts is not the Watts riots anymore. It's the Watts uprising or the uprising in Newark.
Mhm.
At some point, what Stonewall did and what gay liberation as a concept and the Gay Liberation Front did, right, was that it gave people language, right? It replaced homosexual with gay. It came up with the phrase "gay is good,"
Mhm.
which I think nobody wants to say this, but it was taken clearly from Black is Beautiful, from the Black Power movement.
Mhm.
Um, right? And and it was called the Gay Liberation Movement because it was taken from the Women's Liberation Movement, who got their name from the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, which took their name from the National Liberation Front in Algeria. So they're all part of the liberation movement. So the notion of pride, if there was one mandate from the Gay Liberation Front, it was come out and be open and be proud. And of course, in 1970, there was the first march to celebrate Stonewall that has actually come into, all these years later, annual marches across the country, which with many of which have become parades, which is fine, but a parade is not a march.
Right.
And the original Stonewall March was not actually capitalized by Bank of America or Walmart or
Yeah.
or
All
some other major industry, Target, right?
Well, in reading this and thinking about, current events, there seems to have always been some sort of a purity movement. We had the moral majority and other groups that have been against gay relationships, and now we have the Christian nationalists. Their promotion of legislation against trans women, along with the book bans and their idea of a family, are taking us backwards to a very dangerous place. So, what should people do to fight back? These same folks are against anyone of color. So, to me, it's logical that whatever can be accomplished to hurt one group will be used against other groups.
I think so. I don't know if I think Ada may have mailed it out. I'm not sure. I wrote an article for The Guardian in London or the UK a few months ago about what we can learn from the gay movement to fight now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main points was, you have to take direct action. Direct action might be, I think I can go back to the snake pit, right? The direct action might be breaking into the police office and making phone calls to get people out on the street because nobody had cell phones then. Right. So I think what you can do is that you can challenge every book ban. You can challenge every school board. You can run for school board. You can be public. If you're a gay parent with kids, you can show up at school meetings and say this school has to be safe for my children, like everybody's children. You can write letters to papers. But you could, and of course we're coming up to June 14th and the No Kings marches, right? But I think really, that it's really important, right, to actually, and direct action can be anything, right? Direct action can actually be protesting and screaming and throwing things, or it can be writing letters.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when ACT UP came about in 1987 in response to the government doing nothing about, or doing very, very little about the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their slogan was silence equals death,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, I love making these connections, but again, silence equals death literally was taken from the great African-American poet and organizer Audre Lorde's writing, and her essay, "Your silence will not protect you."
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think ACT UP's name is accurate. ACT UP.
Mm-hmm.
In whatever way that you're able to, and that's how change happens.
Well, the two women that you talked about for the new edition of the book, someone wrote a question in regard to Dr. Chung. And I would say that both of those women were radical as well in their time. But Dr. Chung went to medical school as a male. So when and how did she reveal that she was female, and was that an issue for the university?
Well, I think I may have glossed over this. Everybody knew that she was female,
Oh,
but she was essentially dressed as a male, right? So she
okay.
her being assigned female at birth, and her being, she never denied that she was a woman.
Gotcha.
But I think what's amazing was that she actually dressed in a way that if lesbians dressed out on the street at that time, they would have been arrested.
Oh,
right? Because it was most cities, San Francisco maybe a little bit lax about this, but in New York City, there were laws that there was no cross-dressing and you had to have 3 articles of clothing of the that you couldn't have 3 articles of clothing from the wrong gender.
Wow.
Right. So if you were a butch lesbian in the village and you had men's shoes, a tapered shirt, and men's boxer shorts, you could be arrested.
Well, those people's heads would explode now, wouldn't they?
Yeah. No, I have to say,
Just from kids
things,
going to school.
things things look really bad a lot of times, but we have come a long way.
Yeah. Oh, so another person wrote, I love the comment in the introduction that over the years, what bothered me was the entire discussion was predicated on the idea that Dartmouth College was essentially a straight place that was open to gay people. I've worked with an organization that created an open and affirming statement welcoming all people, but I feel like we have missed this part of the discussion. How do we structure conversations that take away that power dynamic so that it is simply a space where we are all welcome?
Well, I think it's a great question, right? Because we've reached a point culturally and politically where pretty much you can't say people aren't welcomed. You can certainly not welcome them and make sure that they don't show up, but nobody states that that they are not welcome. So how do you actually form a really open and inclusive and welcoming situation, right? And I think it takes a lot of hard work. I mean, I actually worked at Dartmouth for actually several, for 12, 13 years before I was at Harvard. Right. And I have to say back then, Dartmouth had lots of gay students. This is 2000, 2012 or so. It was not a particularly welcoming place to students of color, or to openly gay students, or even to closeted gay students, actually. But I think it takes a commitment on everyone's part to personally welcome people
Mhm.
and make sure that that becomes an ethos for the situation, and that it just can't be mouthing the words without any meaning behind it, right? And this includes the admission of some form of reparation, meaning apologizing for past mistakes, um, allowing people to find themselves in a situation and be able feeling free to voice their opinions. I mean, this is a discussion that is going on all the time around universities, around students feeling that they don't have the right to speak up for their own ideas, right? Whether it be, and it's true, whether it be from the left on the right, whether it be about Palestinians or about Israelis, or whether it be about being trans or not being, and I think it's hard. I think it's very hard, and it's something when I run classes that we think about and talk about it all the time, and I don't think we even really we sort of kind of get there, but it's just a struggle.
Well, so a person asks, you're a professor at Harvard. How are the faculty and staff there? And they read that you're willing to take a pay cut for Harvard's legal funds.
Uh, there are some people who did that. It actually was a group which I totally respect, and I'm actually not in this group, but there are a certain amount a group of senior tenured faculty who have decided to do that, and most people who were in the group decided to like do that. I think at Harvard, I think the stakes are not the stakes. The medical school is losing millions, if not billions of dollars in research money. It's a nice symbolic gesture to take a pay cut. It's not going to make up the
It's not
difference.
making a dent in that, is it?
It's just not making a dent, right? I mean, certainly, right, that money can go to actually supporting international students who need to say, so I have I had 4 international students this past semester. All 4 are staying on campus. And the school's putting them up, right? Because they don't want to go home
Mhm.
because they may
Yeah,
not be
'cause
able to come back.
that's what I was Gary saying. They probably wouldn't be able to get back in.
Right. So, that in fact there are, and one is from Egypt, one's from Denmark, and one's actually from Ireland. Well, one's from Egypt and one's from Afghanistan, right? So, I think Harvard faculty and support staff are rallying around this, but I think it's a bigger problem than the faculty can deal with a 10% pay cut.
Yeah. Well, before we get ready to go to the breakout sessions, I just want to bring back up that you're working on an anniversary edition of this book. So when and where will people be able to get it? And are you doing a pre-sale?
Good question. I don't know. So it'll be out in May of 2026, and I'm sure the pre-sale I'm sure it'll be listed by October of this year,
Okay.
because usually it's listed 7 months before it actually appears. But I would also mention that there's if anybody's looking for graduation presents for high school students, there's another edition of the book that I wrote called a Queer History of the United States for Young People, which is a completely different book. It has new material. It's told in stories. It's not told as a long narrative history. It has lots of pictures. So if anybody's looking for a very readable book for younger people, that is available now.
Fantastic.